A quiet night in the city, a haunting melody, and an unexpected act of courage. What happens when a single moment challenges everything we believe about justice and humanity? Watch until the end to discover the powerful truth. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support more stories like this. The night in Los Angeles was quiet, with only the distant hum of cars and the occasional murmur of late-night walkers breaking the stillness. Keanu Reeves, dressed simply in a dark jacket and jeans, walked at a steady pace toward his car. It was one of those rare moments of solitude that he cherished, a quiet escape from the glare of cameras and the chaos of Hollywood. The cool evening air was refreshing, a stark contrast to the bright, suffocating lights of his usual world. As he turned a corner, he heard it. A soft, melancholy tune carried on the wind. It was the sound of a guitar, its notes raw and deeply emotional, filled with a kind of pain that made Keanu stop in his tracks. He tilted his head, listening more closely, and followed the sound until he spotted its source. Under a dim street light, a black man sat hunched over an old, battered guitar. His fingers moved across the strings with a precision and grace that seemed to contradict the instrument's worn state. The man's clothes were frayed, his shoes scuffed to the point of falling apart, and beside him lay a cardboard sign with bold, uneven letters. For food. Thank you for your help. A weathered hat rested in front of him on the ground, containing a few crumpled bills and scattered coins. Keanu stopped a short distance away, taking in the scene. The man wasn't just playing music, he was pouring his heart into it. The melody seemed to tell a story, one of loss and quiet desperation, but also of resilience. A few passers-by glanced at him briefly before hurrying on their way, avoiding eye contact as though the sight of him was a reminder of something they didn't want to confront. Keanu stayed, captivated by the raw emotion in the man's playing. He could see the man's hands trembling slightly as he moved from one chord to the next, but the music never faltered. Then, without warning, the stillness of the moment was shattered. A harsh, commanding voice rang out, cutting through the air like a knife. "I told you to get out of here." The words came from a police officer, tall and broad-shouldered, his tone dripping with disdain as he approached the man with heavy steps. Behind him, a second officer followed, his expression more indifferent but no less intimidating. The first officer stopped in front of the man and, without hesitation, kicked the hat on the ground. The coins and bills scattered across the pavement with a sharp clatter. The man flinched, his hands instinctively moving to shield his guitar. "I told you not to come back here," the officer continued, his voice growing louder. "You think this is some kind of free zone for people like you?" "Please, sir," the man stammered, his voice trembling as he looked up at the officer. "I'm not bothering anyone. I'm just trying to eat." The officer sneered, grabbing the man by the collar of his jacket and hauling him to his feet. "Yeah, I've heard it all before. Every one of you has the same sob story. This isn't your corner, and you're not welcome here." He shoved the man roughly against the wall, his voice low and threatening. "How do you people always find your way into neighborhoods like this? You think you belong here? You don't." The man, his voice barely a whisper, replied, "If you want, I'll leave, sir. Just let me go." His hands were raised in a gesture of surrender, but the officer wasn't finished. "Crawl back to whatever dump you came from," the officer said, stepping back slightly. "And don't even think about coming back, because if you do, we'll make sure you regret it." As the man stumbled forward, the second officer stepped up and, with a swift motion, kicked the guitar lying at his feet. The instrument skidded across the pavement and hit the curb with a loud crack. Strings snapped and the wood splintered, leaving it in pieces. The man let out a sharp cry and dropped to his knees, scrambling to gather the broken pieces of the guitar. His hands shook as he cradled the damaged instrument, his face filled with anguish. "No, no," he whispered, tears welling up in his eyes. "This was my father's guitar. He gave it to me when I was a boy. It's all I have left." The first officer crossed his arms, smirking as he looked down at the man. "Oh, great. Another talented musician, huh? What a joke." He motioned to his partner, who began pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "I tried to do this the easy way, but you people never learn. Let's go. You can play a concert in the holding cell." The man didn't resist as the second officer grabbed his arm and began to cuff him. But before the cuffs could click into place, a calm, steady voice interrupted. "Hey." The officers froze and turned toward the sound. Keanu stepped forward from the shadows, his hands in his pockets, his long hair partially obscuring his face. His tone was measured, but there was an unmistakable authority in it. "What's going on here?" he asked, his eyes moving between the officers and the man on the ground. "This isn't your business," the first officer snapped, his annoyance clear. "Keep walking." Keanu didn't move. Instead, he took another step closer, his calm gaze fixed on the first officer. "Has he done something illegal?" he asked. "He's breaking the law," the second officer interjected, his tone sharp. "Panhandling is prohibited in this area. He's disturbing the peace." Keanu's eyes flicked to the broken guitar in the man's hands. "Playing music isn't disturbing the peace," he said quietly. "It's survival." The first officer squared his shoulders, stepping closer to Keanu. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but you're interfering with police work. Last warning, walk away or you'll be next." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. People whispered among themselves, some pulling out their phones to record. Keanu glanced briefly at the onlookers, then back at the officers. "You broke his guitar," he said evenly. "You humiliated him, and now you're arresting him for trying to survive? That's not enforcing the law. That's cruelty." The first officer's face darkened, his frustration growing. "I said walk away." Keanu didn't flinch. His voice was calm but firm as he replied, "If you're going to arrest him for doing nothing wrong, then arrest me too." The crowd gasped, the murmurs growing louder. The second officer hesitated, but the first, clearly irritated, stepped forward. "Fine," he said, pulling out another pair of cuffs. "Let's do this." As the officer reached for Keanu's hands, he pushed back the hair from his face, revealing his identity. The crowd's whispers turned into shouts. "That's Keanu Reeves!" someone exclaimed. The officers froze for a moment, realization dawning on them, but it was too late. Phones were raised high, recording every second. Keanu's calm expression didn't waver as the first officer cuffed him. The crowd erupted in outrage, their voices growing louder. "What are you doing?" someone yelled. "This is Keanu Reeves." Another shouted, "You're finished. This is going viral." The officers, now visibly uncomfortable, hurriedly led Keanu and the man toward their patrol car as the crowd followed, chanting and shouting. Inside the car, Keanu sat quietly, his expression unreadable. The man beside him held the broken guitar close to his chest, his face a mixture of fear and gratitude. Outside, the crowd's voices faded as the car drove away, but the weight of what had just happened hung heavily in the air. The holding cell was dimly lit, the walls an unwelcoming shade of gray. Keanu Reeves sat calmly on the metal bench inside, his posture relaxed but his eyes focused. Beside him, James, the black guitarist, sat hunched over, his broken guitar clutched tightly to his chest. The strings hung limply, and the wood was splintered, but James held it as though it were the most precious thing in the world. For a while, neither of them spoke, the silence only broken by the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional distant murmur of voices from the police station. Keanu broke the silence first, his voice soft but firm. "What's your name?" he asked, glancing sideways at the man. "James," the man replied quietly, not looking up. "James Carter." Keanu nodded slightly. "I'm Keanu," he said, as though introductions were still necessary. "How are you holding up?" James let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been through worse, I guess, but this feels like the end." Keanu turned toward him more fully, his expression earnest. "It's not the end," he said firmly. "I know it feels that way now, but it's not." James sighed, his fingers brushing over the broken edges of his guitar. "You don't know what it's like," he said, his voice tinged with frustration and exhaustion. "Living like this. Fighting just to get through the day. Watching people look at you like you're nothing. And now," he trailed off, his gaze dropping to the guitar in his hands. "This was all I had left of my father. He gave it to me when I was 10, said music could get me through anything. And it did for a while. But now—" Keanu waited a moment before speaking, giving James the space to gather his thoughts. "What happened?" he asked gently. James hesitated, then exhaled deeply, as though releasing a weight he'd been carrying for years. "I used to play in a band," he began. "We weren't famous or anything, but we got gigs, enough to pay the bills. I had a wife, a daughter, a little house. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. Then everything fell apart. My wife got sick, cancer. We spent everything trying to save her. Sold the house, the car, everything. But it wasn't enough. He stopped, his voice catching in his throat. "She didn't make it. And after that, I couldn't keep it together. I lost my daughter to the system, lost the band, ended up on the streets." Keanu listened intently, his expression one of quiet empathy. James looked at him, tears brimming in his eyes. "This guitar was all I had left. It reminded me of who I used to be, of what I used to have. And now," he gestured to the broken instrument, his voice trembling, "now it's gone too." Keanu leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "It's not gone," he said. "It's just a guitar. I know it means more than that, but it can be fixed. And your story, your talent, no one can take that from you." James shook his head. "What difference does it make? People don't care about stories like mine. They just see a bum on the street and keep walking." "That's not true," Keanu said firmly. "People care more than you think. They just need to see you, really see you. And I'll make sure they do." James looked at him, skepticism and hope warring in his expression. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "You don't even know me." Keanu smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held both warmth and determination. "Because I've been where you are," he admitted. "Not in the same way, but I've felt that weight. I've been at a point where it felt like nothing would ever get better. But someone once told me that if you can help, you should. So that's what I'm doing." Before James could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. A senior officer appeared at the door, his face a mixture of unease and forced authority. He unlocked the cell and stepped inside. "Mr. Reeves," he said stiffly, "you're free to go." Keanu stood but didn't move toward the door. "What about him?" he asked, nodding toward James. The officer hesitated. "He was detained for panhandling and disturbing the peace," he began, but Keanu cut him off. "Disturbing the peace by playing music?" he said, his voice low and firm. "You arrested him for trying to survive. Now you're letting me go because you realized who I am. But he's the one who deserves to walk out of here." The officer shifted uncomfortably. "That's not my decision to make," he said. "I'm just following orders." "Then tell whoever's given the orders that I'm not leaving without him," Keanu said, crossing his arms. The officer stared at him, clearly frustrated, before letting out a long sigh. "Fine," he muttered. "You can both go." He gestured for James to stand, and the younger man hesitantly rose to his feet, still clutching the broken guitar. As they walked through the station, the tension in the air was palpable. Outside, the noise of the crowd could be heard. Reporters, activists, and concerned citizens who had gathered after the video of the arrest went viral. Cameras flashed as soon as Keanu and James stepped through the door, the reporters shouting questions. Keanu raised a hand, quieting the commotion. "What happened tonight isn't just about me," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "It's about how we treat each other. It's about dignity and respect. James deserves that as much as anyone else, and I won't stop until people like him are seen and heard." The crowd erupted into applause and cheers, the energy electric. Keanu and James descended the steps together, the cameras capturing every moment. For the first time in a long time, James stood a little taller, the weight on his shoulders feeling just a little lighter. The days following the incident were a whirlwind for James Carter. The video of his arrest alongside Keanu Reeves had spread like wildfire, making headlines and igniting debates across social media. People from around the world voiced their outrage, demanding justice for James and accountability for the officers involved. For the first time in years, James felt like he wasn't invisible anymore. Keanu had kept his word, ensuring that James's story was heard. The attention was overwhelming, but it also opened doors James never imagined could exist. Keanu wasted no time stepping in to help. The first thing he did was reach out to a renowned guitar craftsman to repair James's broken instrument. Keanu knew how much the guitar meant to him, not just as an object, but as a symbol of his connection to his past. While the repairs were underway, Keanu arranged for James to stay in temporary housing provided by a local nonprofit organization that supported homeless individuals. It was a modest place, but it was clean, warm, and safe. A stark contrast to the streets James had called home for so long. One evening, Keanu visited James at the shelter, carrying a folder filled with papers and a small, hopeful smile. James, though still adjusting to his new surroundings, welcomed him with a nervous but genuine grin. They sat together in the common room, where Keanu spread out the contents of the folder on the table between them. "I've been thinking," Keanu began, his voice calm but purposeful. "You said music was your way of expressing yourself, right? It's what kept you going." James nodded slowly, unsure of where the conversation was headed. "Yeah," he said, "it's the only thing I've ever been good at." Keanu leaned forward, his eyes intent. "Then let's get you back to it. I've got something in mind." He slid a flyer across the table. It was for a charity event scheduled to take place in a week, with the goal of raising funds for housing initiatives for the homeless. "I've spoken to the organizers," Keanu continued. "They'd love for you to perform. This could be a chance for you to share your music and your story with people who need to hear it." James stared at the flyer, his hands resting on the table. "I don't know," he admitted after a long pause. "I haven't played in front of people in years. What if I mess up? What if they don't care?" Keanu's expression softened, and he placed a reassuring hand on James's shoulder. "They'll care," he said, "because your music comes from a place that people can feel. And if you mess up, that's okay. You're not doing this to be perfect. You're doing it to remind people that no matter what life throws at you, there's always something worth fighting for." James hesitated but eventually nodded, his lips curving into a faint smile. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll do it." The week leading up to the event was a flurry of preparation. Keanu ensured that James had everything he needed, from clothes for the performance to time in a small studio to rehearse. The repaired guitar arrived just 2 days before the event, and when James opened the case, his breath caught. The instrument looked almost brand new, though the craftsman had left a few small scars intact, saying they were part of its story. James ran his fingers over the polished wood and fresh strings, feeling a wave of emotions he couldn't quite put into words. The night of the event arrived, and the venue buzzed with excitement. The room was filled with people, philanthropists, activists, musicians, and everyday citizens moved by James's story. Keanu had made sure the spotlight was on James, but he remained quietly supportive in the background, ready to step in if needed. James stood backstage, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the guitar strap over his shoulder. His nerves were palpable, but so was his determination. Keanu appeared beside him, his presence calm and grounding. "You ready?" he asked. James took a deep breath, nodded, and said, "As ready as I'll ever be." When James stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. The audience watched intently as he positioned the guitar and adjusted the microphone. For a moment, he closed his eyes, letting the gravity of the moment wash over him. Then, with a deep breath, he began to play. The first few notes were soft and tentative, but as he continued, his confidence grew. The melody he played was raw and emotional, a reflection of his journey, his struggles, his losses, and the glimmers of hope that had kept him going. The room seemed to hold its breath, every eye fixed on James as his music filled the space. By the time he finished, the audience was completely captivated. There was a moment of silence, and then the room erupted into applause. Some stood, others wiped away tears, but all were deeply moved. Backstage, James was met with a flood of congratulations. People approached him, thanking him for sharing his story and his music. Among them was a music producer who handed him a business card saying, "You have something special. If you're interested, let's talk." Keanu found James amid the crowd, his face beaming with pride. "I told you," he said, "you've still got it." James laughed, a sound that felt foreign but welcome. "I guess I just needed someone to believe in me." Over the next few weeks, James's life began to transform. The funds raised at the event helped him secure stable housing, and he started teaching guitar to kids at a local community center. His story continued to inspire others, with donations pouring into the charity that had supported him. Keanu remained a constant presence, checking in on him regularly and celebrating every milestone. One evening, as they sat together on a park bench, James turned to Keanu and asked, "Why did you do all this? You didn't have to get involved that night." Keanu thought for a moment before replying. "Because I could," he said simply, "and because someone like you shouldn't be forgotten." James nodded, his gaze drifting to the skyline as the sun set. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." The story of Keanu Reeves and James Carter became a symbol of hope and resilience, a reminder that even small acts of kindness can lead to something much greater. It wasn't just about a man and his guitar, It was about the power of compassion and the courage to stand up for what's right. And for James, it was the start of a new chapter, one filled with music, purpose, and the belief that second chances are worth fighting for. One act of courage can change everything. What did you think of this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear from you. If this video inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that make a difference.